the obese girl was laughed off the train until the cowboy offered his hand. They didn't just laugh at her. They made room for it, like cruelty was part of the ticket price. And when the conductor shouted for her to move it, the platform answered with snickers that rolled down the line of passengers like a dirty wave, because the girl in the worn brown dress was heavy, and the world loved pretending that made her less human. And she stood there with a small valise that looked too light for the life she carried. Cheeks burning as a woman in a feathered hat covered her smile with a gloved hand, and a pair of boys mimicked her waddling step. And the girl tried to climb up anyway, one boot on the metal step, fingers gripping the rail. But someone behind her hissed, "You'll break the damn thing." And the words hit harder than the winter wind cutting between the cars. The conductor didn't protect her. He protected the schedule. "Off," he barked, jabbing a thumb at the planks. And when she swallowed and asked, barely audible, "Sir, please, I've paid," he leaned in with the stale smell of tobacco and impatience and said louder, for the crowd to enjoy, "Paid for one seat, not the whole coach." A laugh burst from somewhere, then another, until even the quiet ones joined with that ugly little sound people make when they're relieved the target isn't them. And the girl's eyes flashed wet, but she kept them wide, refusing to let tears spill where they could drink them like entertainment. And she stepped down because the rail was slipping in her glove, and because she knew how quickly a shove could become a fall when everyone was already thinking she deserved it. Her boot hit the platform, then the other. The door slammed as if the train itself wanted her erased, and she stood there in a pocket of space that widened around her like fear of contagion, the valise handle digging into her palm, her breath loud in her ears, and she felt that familiar thing, the moment where you decide whether to beg, fight, or disappear. "Go on," someone called. And the boys laughed again, and a man with a newspaper muttered, "Should have stayed home." As if home was a place that welcomed girls like her. She stared at the train window, catching her own reflection for a second. Round face, hair pinned tight, jaw clenched so hard it ached. And she told herself she didn't need them. She didn't. Except her ticket was in that conductor's pocket now, and her money was gone, and the nearest town sat miles out past the scrub. And the sun had the thin look of a day that would die early. That's when she felt it. Not a sound, not a touch, but the pressure of being seen in a different way, like a shadow stepping between her and the laughter. At the far end of the platform, half turned away from the noise, a cowboy stood with a bedroll strapped behind his saddle and dust on his boots that didn't match the clean boards, hat brim low, over eyes that didn't flinch. And while everyone else looked at her like a joke, he looked at the men who were joking like he was measuring how far they'd go. He didn't hurry. He didn't shout. He simply started walking toward her, slow and certain. And the strangest thing happened. The laughter thinned, not because the crowd grew kind, but because something in his stride suggested there would be a price for continuing. The girl's throat tightened, not with hope. Hope had betrayed her too many times. But with a sharp, confusing question, she couldn't stop. Why would a stranger step into this for me? The train pulled away with a shudder and a scream of iron, leaving behind a sudden quiet that felt louder than the mockery had. And as the smoke drifted off the platform, the people who had laughed found other places to put their eyes. Because cruelty is brave only while it's shared. And the girl stood there unsure whether to move or vanish, the valise still in her hand like proof she had planned to belong somewhere. When the conductor pocketed the ticket and turned his back as if the matter had concluded itself. "Next stop's 20 miles, he said to no one in particular, already calling for baggage, and a woman tugged her child closer, not out of concern, but out of habit, as if misfortune were catching. The cowboy reached the girl and stopped a few steps away, close enough that she could smell leather and cold dust, far enough that she wouldn't feel cornered. And he tipped his hat, not to her body, not to her embarrassment, but to her eyes, then turned his head to the men who had been loudest. "You done?" he asked, calm as still water, and one of the boys snorted until the cowboy's gaze settled on him, and the sound died halfway out of his mouth. "We didn't touch her," a man said quickly, spreading his hands, the newspaper drooping, and the cowboy nodded once. "I noticed," he replied, and that was worse, because it named the sin they wanted to keep invisible. The girl shifted, heat flooding her face again, and she took a step back, ready to walk anywhere if it meant not being the reason this stranger got pulled into something ugly. But the cowboy spoke to her then, not loud, not soft, just enough to reach. "Miss," he said, and waited until she looked. "You got somewhere you need to be before dark?" The question cracked something she'd been holding together with stubbornness alone, because the answer was yes and no at the same time, and she shook her head once, afraid her voice would fail her in front of them all. Around them, people pretended to be busy. Ropes checked, crates shifted, while listening hard, because nothing holds attention like the chance to see kindness punished. The cowboy glanced toward the empty stretch of track, then back to the conductor. "You took her fare," he said, not accusing, not asking. The conductor bristled. "Company policy," he replied. "And company don't seat freight." The word hung there, sharp and small, and the girl felt it land where the laughter had already bruised her. But before she could fold into herself, the cowboy stepped half a pace forward, placing himself, not blocking her, just present. "Then company can keep its money," he said, and the platform leaned in without moving, waiting to see if he would argue, threaten, make a show. He didn't. He simply reached into his coat, drew out a folded bill, and held it where the conductor could see it. "I'll buy a seat," he added, eyes never leaving the man's face, "and I'll ride standing, if that's what it takes." The conductor scoffed, but the certainty in the cowboy's posture unsettled him, and while he hesitated, the girl stared at the offered bill like it was a dare, her heart hammering with a dangerous thought she hadn't allowed herself yet. That this wasn't pity, and it wasn't charity either. And whatever it was about to ask her a question back. Would you let someone stand with you, even if it cost them? The conductor took the bill with a look that tried to be bored and failed, then snapped a signal to the porter and muttered about 1 seat only. And the platform exhaled its disappointment, because nothing entertains like a fight that never quite starts. And as the steps were lowered again, the girl felt the weight of every eye return to her. Curious now in a different way, measuring whether she would accept the thing she had been denied so publicly, because acceptance can be another kind of exposure. And she hesitated with the valise hanging from her fingers, the metal handle cold enough to sting, when the cowboy turned, not toward the train, but toward her, and extended his hand, open and steady, palm up as if he were offering not help, but a choice. He didn't say, "Come on," or "It's all right." He said nothing at all, which somehow made it harder, because there was no script to hide behind, just his hand and the space between them. And in that space lived every time she had been stared at, corrected, hurried, laughed past, and she felt the old instinct to refuse, to spare him the looks and herself the risk of being the spectacle again. But the train hissed impatiently, and the conductor barked for movement. The crowd leaned in with that small, mean hunger. And the cowboy's fingers didn't twitch, didn't curl, didn't plead. If I take it, she thought, they'll say I needed it. If she didn't, they'd say worse. Her throat tightened and she lifted her chin, meeting his eyes, searching for anything like condescension and finding none. Only an expectation that she was capable of deciding. And she placed her valise on the step and set her hand in his, surprised by the warmth of it, the firm pressure that adjusted to her grip instead of swallowing it. And when she stepped up, he moved with her, not pulling, not leading, just matching. And a murmur rippled along the platform as if a rule had been quietly broken. The boys fell silent. The woman in the feathered hat looked away. The man with the newspaper folded it too neatly. Inside the coach, seats creaked as people shifted to watch, and the conductor's jaw worked while he waved them through. And as they reached the doorway, the cowboy finally spoke. Low enough that only she could hear. "Name's Eli," he said, like names were for equals. And the train lurched and began to move, and the platform slid past with its stares and judgments shrinking into smoke. And the girl, still holding his hand, realized the cost of this choice would come later. But for the first time that day, she was not paying it alone. Inside the coach, the air was warmer, but no kinder, thick with coal smoke and curiosity. And as the girl stepped in, she felt the eyes slide back onto her like hooks, finding familiar skin, not laughing now, just assessing, deciding what kind of story she would become once the shock wore off. And she nearly pulled her hand free out of habit until she noticed how the cowboy slowed his pace to match hers, giving her time to choose where to stand, where to look, how to breathe. Seats filled quickly as people shifted their parcels and coats, some turning their shoulders away, others lingering a second too long before pretending not to stare. And the conductor pointed toward a narrow space near the end, with a gesture that said, "Don't get comfortable." But Eli nodded once and moved there without comment, placing his bedroll against the wall and bracing himself with one boot as the train rocked forward. A standing man among seated ones. An inconvenience made visible. The girl hovered, unsure whether to sit would invite resentment or standing would invite collapse. And she chose the seat nearest the aisle because it felt like less of a lie, her valise tucked at her feet, her hands folded in her lap to keep them from shaking, while across from her, a woman's mouth tightened as if forced politeness were a muscle she'd rather not use. The train gathered speed, boards clattering beneath them. And with each mile, the platform shrank into something unreal. Yet the girl's chest stayed tight, because safety that arrives suddenly has a way of feeling temporary, like a chair offered just before it's pulled away. Eli kept his gaze on the window. Not to ignore her, but to give her room. And when the train lurched hard, he shifted his weight so his shoulder blocked her from a jolt, casual as if it were nothing. And she hated how quickly gratitude burned into something like fear. Fear that this was borrowed, fear that it would be reclaimed. Somewhere down the coach, a man muttered about standards, and another answered with a laugh that tried and failed to sound easy, and the girl stared at the floorboards, counting knots in the wood, reminding herself she had survived worse than whispers. Minutes passed. Then more. No one ordered her out. No hand grabbed her arm. The train did not stop. Her breathing slowed, and in that quiet pocket she realized the danger hadn't vanished. It had only changed shape. Because now the question wasn't whether she would be pushed away, but whether she could trust a kindness that had chosen her in front of everyone. By the time the train settled into its long, steady pull across open land, the coach had found a rhythm that dulled conversation into murmurs and let private thoughts grow loud. And the girl watched the landscape slide past the window in wide, empty strokes. Fields giving way to scrub to low hills. Each mile taking her farther from the platform and closer to the fear that quiet would invite questions. Eli shifted his stance when his leg cramped and finally took the empty edge of a bench opposite her, not crowding, not claiming, just resting like a man who understood distance. And when he glanced at her, it was with the same unmeasuring look he'd given her outside, as if bodies were facts and stories were what mattered. She told herself she didn't owe him anything, not an explanation, not gratitude shaped into performance. But the words pressed anyway, heavy as the valise at her feet, because carrying silence had been her work for years, and it was tiring. "I was supposed to meet my sister," she said at last, surprised by how steady her voice sounded now that the train was moving. And he nodded once, inviting the rest without pulling for it. And she went on, halting at first, then faster, telling him about boarding houses that charged extra for her size, about jobs that ended when customers complained, about the way laughter could follow a person like a shadow, even into rooms meant to be safe. She did not say the word fat. She did not need to. Eli listened without interruption, eyes on her face, not drifting to the places the world liked to inventory. And when she finished, he didn't offer advice or pity, didn't try to fix a life he'd met an hour ago. "That's a lot to carry," he said simply. And the plainness of it loosened something in her chest she hadn't realized was clenched. Outside, the sky thinned toward afternoon, and inside the coach, a card game started and died. And the woman across from them finally looked at the girl directly, then away again, unsettled by the sight of her being treated as ordinary. The girl felt a strange mix of warmth and unease bloom together, because being seen without being judged was new, and new things demand a price later. And as the train rolled on, she wondered how long this pocket of dignity could last before the world remembered to collect. The trouble didn't announce itself with shouting. It crept back the way it always did, wearing familiar faces and a sense of being owed. And when the train slowed at a small junction where freight waited on a siding, the door at the far end opened and cold air rushed in, carrying two men from the platform, one of them the newspaper man from earlier. His collar turned up now as if the chill were the only reason he'd followed. And the other, a broader fellow with a laugh that arrived a second before his mouth did. They took in the coach with quick, practiced glances. And when they saw her, their looks stuck, not surprised, not curious, but satisfied, like hunters confirming tracks. "Well, I'll be," the broad one said, loud enough to travel. She made it after all. Conversation thinned. Cards stopped. A porter shifted his grip on a rail and did nothing. The girl felt the warmth drain from her limbs, the old calculations flooding back, how to make herself smaller, how to disappear without moving. And she stared at her hands, willing them not to shake. While the men drifted closer, with the confidence of people who knew silence would make room for them. "Ain't right," the newspaper man added, tapping the bench with his knuckles. Taking seats meant for decent folk. Eli rose before either of them reached her, not fast, not threatening, just enough to change the shape of the aisle, and the train rocked, metal singing as he planted his boot and looked at them both. "You're blocking passage," he said, mild as a statement of weather, and the broad man snorted. "We're talking," he replied. To her. The word landed like a claim, and the girl's chest tightened as she waited for the next thing people always said, that it was better if she moved, better if she apologized, better if she didn't make trouble. But Eli didn't glance back at her to ask. He kept his eyes on the men and shook his head once. "You're done," he said. And something in the flatness of it made the porter finally clear his throat, and the card players look away again, because authority had arrived wearing the wrong clothes. The newspaper man scoffed, but his voice wavered. "You ain't law," he said. Eli nodded. "No," he agreed. but I know when a thing's wrong." The train jerked as if punctuating the point, and the men hesitated, measuring a cost they hadn't expected, while the girl realized with a mix of fear and relief that the laughter had found its edge again. And this time, it wasn't hers. The men backed off with the thin smiles of people who planned to return. And the coach breathed again. But the quiet that followed was brittle. The kind that cracks under a careless word, and as Eli sat back down, the girl felt eyes slide away from her in practiced relief, as if the danger had been weather rather than choice. The train rolled on, wheels drumming a steady argument beneath the floor, and she told herself to be grateful, to hold on to the small victory. Yet doubt seeped in the way it always did after kindness, slow, patient, convincing, because protection had a way of attracting punishment. And she had learned early who usually paid it. When Eli leaned toward the window to stretch his leg, she caught a whisper from 2 seats back, not meant for her, but sharp enough to find her anyway, about trouble following certain people, about how a man could lose work for choosing the wrong cause, and the words settled heavy in her stomach as if they were facts instead of fears. She imagined him turned away at the next stop. Imagined the same conductor smiling then, imagined herself standing alone again with her valise and a fresh bruise of hope. And the thought hurt worse than the laughter had. When Eli returned his attention to her, she forced a smile that felt like a lie and said she might step down at the next town, that she didn't want to make things harder than they already were. And he studied her for a long moment without arguing, without soothing, as if weighing what mattered more, her pride or her safety, and nodded once. "I won't stop you," he said, and the permission stung because it respected her fear. The train slowed for a bend, sunlight slanting across the aisle, and in that brief brightness she saw herself reflected in the glass again, round and solid and tired of apologizing for existing. And the question pressed until it hurt. Was leaving another kind of surrender, or the only way to keep him from paying for her being here? The decision came not with drama, but with motion. The train screeching into the next town and jolting everyone forward as if demanding answers now. And the girl rose with the others out of habit, fingers closing around her valise before she'd fully chosen. While on the platform outside, a foreman waited with a clipboard and a familiar look of appraisal that slid past faces and landed where it thought leverage lived. Eli stepped down first to stretch his leg, and the foreman's eyes caught the shape of him and softened, then hardened again when he glanced past and saw her preparing to follow. And whatever work was about to be offered shifted its weight. "We don't need trouble," the foreman said quietly. Not unkind, not apologetic. And Eli understood at once what was being asked, because men like that always did. The favor framed as reason, the cost disguised as order. He could nod, take the work, and let the train carry her on alone with her careful dignity intact. And no one would blame him. The world would call it sensible. Instead, he turned back toward the steps and then held out his hand again. This time not to lift her, but to stop her from stepping down. And the gesture cost him immediately, the foreman's mouth tightening as if a door had closed. "Your choice," the man said, already writing something else. And Eli nodded, accepting the consequence without comment. While behind them the conductor cleared his throat, and the boys from earlier watched with narrowed interest, sensing the shift of power they had come to enjoy. The girl froze, heat and cold crashing together in her chest, because now the math was unmistakable. Staying meant he would lose something real, something he hadn't even named. And she shook her head, trying to pull her hand free, whispering that she could go, that she always did. But his grip stayed gentle and firm. "You don't owe me leaving," he said, low and steady, and the words struck harder than any plea because they placed the choice back where it belonged. The whistle blew, the train lurched. She stepped back inside as the door slammed and the platform slid away. And in the sudden quiet, she felt the weight of what he had given up settle between them, not as a debt to be repaid, but as proof that dignity, once offered, sometimes demanded courage to accept. It happened at the next major stop, where the train paused long enough for people to believe their opinions mattered again. And as the doors opened, the same men from before appeared with a station agent whose badge looked important enough to borrow authority, their confidence renewed by the comfort of paperwork. "There's a complaint," the agent announced, voice practiced and empty, eyes sliding to the girl and then away, as if naming her would make it messy. And a hush rippled through the coach because everyone recognized the ritual. Someone had been singled out, and silence would be rewarded. The agent spoke of regulations and comfort and fairness, words that bent easily when pointed in the right direction, and he gestured toward the aisle as if inviting cooperation. And the girl felt the familiar heat rise again, the urge to stand before she was told to save everyone the trouble of deciding. Eli rose first. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't insult the rules. He simply asked, "Which one?" The agent blinked. "Which one what?" Eli nodded toward the seats. "Which rule says she can't ride?" he said. And the question landed wrong, because rules are meant to be waived, not examined. The newspaper man smirked. "Common sense," he offered, and Eli shook his head. "That's not written," he replied. The agent cleared his throat, stalling, and around them people shifted, suddenly aware that choosing sides would be noticed, that quiet might be mistaken for agreement. "She paid," Eli continued, holding the agent's gaze. "And I paid again. You want to put someone off? Put me off." The girl grabbed his sleeve, panic flaring, but he didn't look back, and the agent hesitated with the look of a man who knew he could win only if no one watched closely. A woman near the window spoke then, surprising herself as much as anyone, saying she'd seen the ticket, that there was no trouble until trouble was made. And another voice followed, then another. Not loud, not brave, but enough to change the math. The agent glanced at the platform, at the thinning crowd, at the cost of insisting, and finally stepped aside with a stiff nod. "Let's move on," he said, and the doors closed, and the train pulled away, carrying with it a silence that felt earned, the kind that arrives after laughter has been told no. The girl sank back into her seat, shaking, and for the first time she understood that justice didn't always roar. Sometimes it simply refused to make room for cruelty. When the train slowed for her stop, evening had settled gently over the land, the sky bruised purple and gold as if the day itself were learning how to rest. And the girl gathered her valise without the old rush to disappear, pausing instead to feel the steady ground through the soles of her boots as the doors opened and a breath of cool air rolled in, carrying the scent of wood smoke and damp earth. Eli rose and stepped aside first, not guiding her, not claiming the moment, just making room the way he always had. And she moved past him with a quiet certainty that surprised her, aware of eyes but no longer ruled by them, aware of her body without apology, aware that she was leaving this train different than she had boarded it. On the platform there was no laughter waiting, no eager inspection, only the ordinary shuffle of travelers and a lamplighter moving down the line. And she stood there a second longer than necessary, letting the absence of cruelty feel real enough to trust. Eli followed and tipped his hat, the gesture small and clean, and when the whistle sounded, he offered his hand once more. Not to pull her anywhere, but to meet her where she was. and she took it without hesitation, feeling the strength there not as rescue, but as recognition. "You'll do fine," he said, not with optimism, but with the calm of a man who had watched her choose herself in front of others. And she believed him because the proof had been paid for, mile by mile. The train began to move again, iron singing as it carried the past away. And she turned toward the road into town, her steps unhurried, her shoulders squared not in defiance, but in ease, knowing there would be harder days ahead and smaller kindnesses too, knowing the world would not suddenly soften, but also knowing she had learned how dignity feels when it is offered publicly and accepted without shrinking. As the platform emptied and the lamps glowed, she walked on with her valise swinging lightly at her side, not rescued, not hidden, simply present, carrying with her the quiet understanding that belonging is not a favor granted by crowds, but a space claimed when one person is brave enough to stand and another is brave enough to stay.